Welcome to What We Gon' Do. I'm Tre Borden, and this week we are talking about elections. I don't even need to tell you how important they are. We are interviewing today Morgan Harper, who is a candidate in the primary election for Ohio's 3rd District for Congress. It's an overwhelmingly Democratic district, and so the winner of the primary in April would have been the presumptive winner of the November election. We talked to Morgan about her campaign to unseat Joyce Beatty and how COVID-19 kind of upended and impacted her primary campaign. And we really appreciate you coming and talking to us, Morgan. And here's what she had to say.
So I think just to get started, kind of obviously your primary was April 28th, which is a week ago, kind of the start of this. How are you doing? Like, how are you feeling after? I mean, it's a lot of buildup, and then it's like now we're a week out. Like, how are you doing just personally?
Yeah, it's a lot of buildup. And then we had our first election day, March 17th. So we had kind of build up to that and recovery. And then this one, I mean, it sucks to lose. So that wasn't good. And it does feel a little bit like a mourning process in a way, because you're spending so much time with our team, and we have a very close team. And then you just have to process those results. So, it's tough, but at the same time, and I posted this on social media, and I mean it, a couple days after, this is just the beginning, and we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot to build from and a lot to learn from. So I'm excited about figuring out what the next steps look like, but it's tough. We wanted to win. So that's hard.
Right. And I mean, it's tough, and we're also kind of on top of everything else we're going through. Right. So I think that makes it maybe a little bit more impactful. Like, how has that changed it? Kind of like to be right back in this like ridiculous world that we're in right now.
Yeah, for me, and I think the whole team feels this way too. This is the first time I've fully absorbed this pandemic era, just being at home without a million and one things to do all day long. So it's tough, and it actually gives me a lot of perspective on what we were hearing from people we were talking to on the phones about, not wanting to deal with the voting process, and because it's depressing. You losing your jobs. We have no clarity on what's coming our way, and expecting people to go through an absentee ballot process. It's not fun, but I'm just trying to structure my time and reconnect with a lot of people, and but yeah, it's a slog. We're in a tough period right now, and also feeling like, we really need better leadership. And I want so badly for our generation to be able to have that voice and guide some of what's happening and what we have to come ahead as well. So I'm really rooting for a lot of other progressive candidates who are running.
Right. So let's get back into that time, like the reason for you running. Because obviously what really impressed me about you is that you're talented and educated, and could do anything you want with your time in order to make an impact. And you chose to kind of come home, which I identify. Why did you want to run for Congress, and kind of what did you hope to change?
Well, in a lot of ways, I didn't feel like I had a choice. And, like we talked about a lot during the campaign, I mean, I got warnings to not do this, and I couldn't listen to those because, I had early life experiences here that set me on the path to pursue a career in public policy, become a lawyer. And it was all with a vision of serving this community, coming home eventually, and being able to enact what I learned eventually was the systemic change needed to actually make sure everybody gets a fair shot. And looking around, and especially having had the experience in Washington, I worked at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and saw what the state of Washington was. And I'm feeling like we have been bought and sold off to corporations and corporate interests. And if we're going to get our country back on track, it's going to take an entirely different style of political leader and leadership, and it has to be grassroots. And I felt so strongly about that. And this is the 3rd district, my home. And I was like, we could be a part of that. And if we're not, one of the youngest congressional districts in the country, one of the lowest income congressional districts in the country, if we're not, and safely democratic, then no progressive legislation is going to happen. So we went for it. And yeah, I just felt so strongly that we are in this moment now of crossroads as a country and as a community. And we have to have leaders that are at minimum being honest about what's going on, and also what are the policy solutions that are going to make sure we have a more stable future.
I think for a lot of people who might be listening to this, who are young and motivated and feel like so much change is necessary, but the kind of want to not hate their lives. Like, Congress might not seem like the most natural choice. What was
Yeah.
it like approaching this as kind of an outsider?
It was scary. Before I launched the campaign, I was having trouble eating, and I'm not an easily stressed out person. So it was kind of like weird feelings for me. Yeah. And all throughout, just getting used to not necessarily being liked or considered, just a very affable colleague, which is generally, I would say, my experience in the professional world, always having good relationships. And this is a totally different ball game, being in the political arena and making such a bold move against someone who is so well known and established. But in many ways, I mean, I felt like, what is the point of all of the professional experiences I've had of going to all these elite institutions if I don't have the freedom to speak out about what's going on? Then God help us, really, right? And I've always been coming from a place of honesty. And so, I think people respected that, and more people came to understand throughout the course of the campaign that this wasn't some sort of personally motivated attack. This was a real statement about where our communities are at, and my belief and really the movement that we built, a belief in the policies that would make a difference. What's sad is that is so controversial to people, right? That we only have career politicians.
We can crush their idealism.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Crush the idealism. And by that point, you're not viewing the position for, am I the best suited for it? Do I have the right skill set for it? It's just a means to an end. And I think that approach to politics needs to end. I don't know why anyone would want me running for city council, for example. I've never worked in local government. Like, what would that even mean? I have a federal policy background. So this is also the role in government where I feel like I could have the most value, and why we think people have to their dues or wait their turn. That to me is exactly why we're in the mess part of the reason why we're in the mess that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is about this is urgent. This is not about we have till the rest of our lives to figure this mess out. This is crumbling.
I'm fed up, and I've been at this. People often throughout the campaign in my life, it's like, think maybe I'm a little younger. It's like, well, and millennials generally, right? I'm 30. I'll be 37 this summer, so closer to 40 than 30 at this point, right?
Sure.
And I've worked at a policy think tank. I worked in the federal government and the bureaucracy. I've worked for a federal judge. I feel like I've earned the right to at least say what I think is going on, right? And again, this should not be controversial. And if it is, then I think it has a lot more to do with everybody wanting to protect the status quo than actually looking about, what's the best thing to move us all forward.
Right. And so I think that now's a good time to move on to kind of what was the architecture of the campaign kind of pre Miss Rona coming through and just messing everything up. I mean, obviously you needed to educate a lot of people, not just about who you were, but maybe why the status quo wasn't working. Kind of what was your campaign strategy and approach initially?
Yeah. We launched last July, and we had a heavy emphasis from the start on my personal story. The fact that I was born here, that I was given up for adoption, that I lived in a foster home as an infant, that I was raised on the East Side by my mom, who's a public school educator. And the reason for that was to root me in the community. I mean, we knew that one of the attacks against us, which proved to be true throughout the campaign, which one of the things that I found was quite troubling, actually, coming from the establishment, trying to paint me as this outsider, interloper, not one of us, and it's like, no, I mean, this is my home, this is my community, and this community made me. And so, we really started fresh with that. But then also this message of, the why I'm doing this has very little to do with me. It's about a belief in this place, and really feeling like we have to all engage in this political process, the Morganized thing, which is our hashtag.
I love that, by the way. I love wordplay.
Yeah. Very catchy. So that was the idea. And, early days, it was me and, a few local people who had been involved in other grassroots movements, and a son of a former colleague of mine who, came to Columbus, was willing to work on it, my fiance. And we started like that at my dining room table. And then the first guy, Sage is his name, who worked on the campaign, we would just show up to civic association meetings, to different community events, 5Ks, and I would announce, my name's Morgan Harper, I'm running for the 3rd Congressional District. Usually response is, what's that? Because most people have no idea what congressional district they live in. I tell them, I'm running against Joyce Beatty specifically. And then the response was almost invariably, especially over the summer, whoa. Like,
who said
yeah,
what now?
Yeah, who against who? It was like, no, that doesn't just happen. You're crazy, And I was like, no, I mean it, and this is why I'm doing this. And then people kind of pause and listen, and like, well, good luck, honey, But that's what it was. And we posted on social. We always had like a really heavy emphasis on social media because we were building our own movement from scratch, more or less, and had to engage and meet people where they're at, which is another big theme of the campaign. We can't wait for people to just magically come to us. We had to build our own momentum. So, and eventually, and that's been one of the things that's been so exciting and why I am really excited about the next steps and all of that is eventually more and more people just started to come. So it went from me and Sage to, by the end of August, we got an official office space and we had a kickoff event and we had over 100 people show up to this kickoff event, very few of whom I knew. Because they had heard about it on Twitter or they had seen an Intercept article about the campaign, and it just steadily grew and grew. So, that was how we built this, and it truly has been a grassroots effort.
When did you get an inkling that the COVID-19 could change the calculus of either how you ran your campaign, or when did you start thinking like this might actually change the election date last minute? Like, when did that start to come into play?
That really for us wasn't until a couple of weeks before our original election day. So you're absolutely right. I mean, for the campaign, it was like before we got to Corona, it was pre-January and post-January, because January was the first time that we had someone join the campaign who had any prior congressional experience, because we were running with all of the Democratic presidential candidates running as well. It was a real talent vacuum. And so it took a long time for us to get the core position, like an official field director who had worked on a congressional campaign before. And once we got that, I mean, things just really started clicking. We knocked, 90,000 doors or something. Door knocking always had been a key part of the strategy, but we were able to accelerate everything we had built since the summer in that period, and just a ton of momentum. I mean, when I tell you, like, it was just flying. We started to lift. We had debates with my opponent. No one thought that was a given. We had 2 that she showed up for, 2 that she skipped, all of this building up towards the March 17th primary date. And then I would say like a week and a half out was when people were really starting to absorb what was going on in Italy, other parts of the world. And we held our first community conversation at that point, still in person, where we were talking to elders about some of their fears. And we had a nurse who had been one of our volunteers answer questions about how to keep themselves safe, that kind of thing. But it was really leading up to our Get Out the Vote GOTV weekend, that final weekend before the 17th, where it was like, oh no, I mean, this is all just like slowly we're having to restrict our activity. We were supposed to have a ton of volunteers that were local and coming in from out of town. Virtually every out of town person canceled, which made sense based on, people who might be coming from DC, New York, wherever. Sure. And then we ultimately had to cancel canvassing. And that was really, a hard call to make in some ways, because that is the root of our strategy.
Right, this is what we need to win.
This is what we need to win, to make sure the people we have connected with actually vote, and then we can no longer knock their doors. So we had to transition from the door knocking to just lit drops, which, still somewhat effective, but a different experience.
Lit drops just mean dropping literature, like just all your written materials and saying,
yeah, just at the door.
Morgan was here.
Yes, exactly. Pretty much, but with a much more limited volunteer base, because people were staying home. And that Sunday before the election date was when the governor finally made the call to close bars and restaurants. And that's where we saw even like early voting turnout really drop off. Ohio has 3 weeks of early voting before the official primary date. So we had been canvassing at early voting. And by the last day of early voting, people were starting to just pull back entirely.
Was it still unclear at this point whether the election was going to proceed as scheduled or not?
It was completely on track. I mean, if you can call it that, they were saying that, we were going to March 17th, still in-person voting. And so on the phones and everything, we transitioned to mostly trying to call people phone bank. We were still telling them go in person on March 17th. The Secretary of State and the governor held a few press conferences, the first of which was about a week and a half out, where they announced they were closing Ohio State campus. And, our reaction was, and I went to that press conference actually, and I was like, well, what's the game plan to make sure that these people can still vote, right? I mean, you're going to close the campus, which agree with, but that's, several thousand registered voters who vote on Ohio State campus, and a lot of students who might not be coming back to town. So it's just like the disenfranchisement train started to just really roll.
We'll get into
and it wasn't until, though, the night before the official election day that the governor announced he was going to postpone in-person voting and mandate that all polling locations be closed the next day. Then a judge that same night ruled overturning the governor's order, saying he didn't have the authority to do that. It wasn't legal for him to do that, until ultimately the governor came back at like almost midnight saying, no, he was proceeding with a public health order to close the polls. So that was a very chaotic night where we were just like, oh my God, it's off, it's on, like get out the lid drop video together. And it was a mess, honestly. But, ultimately I wanted everybody to be safe. It was clear voters were starting to get really nervous about voting. The polling locations often have a lot of elderly people who volunteer to work them. That didn't seem like a good idea. Like we're seeing, in Wisconsin, that they went forward with it. So right call, but then ultimately the decisions that were made after that, I think, led to further disenfranchisement.
So I think that, obviously you can't anticipate this type of pandemic. I mean, couldn't come at a worse time for you and your candidacy and for a lot of other people. And I think that what was really difficult, like you said, is that there's no game plan for after the change.
Right.
So how do we now, if we're going to have weeks longer to implement a safe strategy for voting, how do we make that not equal to many people not being able to have access to voting? Yeah. How did your campaign adjust to kind of like make up the delta of that? But also, how do you think the existing issues around disenfranchisement were exacerbated or kind of adjusted by this? Like, did it make a lot of problems that existed worse, or are there different problems?
Well, the existing structure for absentee voting already is a mess here in Ohio, to be honest. And so ultimately the decision was made about a week and a half after that original election date to, and this was the state legislature signing a bill that said, we've got a new date. It's going to be April 28th. There will be no in-person voting unless you have a disability or you're homeless. And it's going to be all mail-in absentee. And for a lot of people in Ohio and in the 3rd district, these are not people that usually vote absentee, right? So it's the first time people are even thinking about what it looks like to vote absentee, while they're being told that they have to stay at home because there's an infectious disease that's taking hold of our whole country and could kill them, while they're also learning that they are not going to have a job anymore. And we're going to give you 3 weeks to also make sure you get out and vote. But don't get out, just figure out how to do that from your house.
Send out your vote.
And I mean, to me, it was that timeline was just crazy. It's like, what is the rush when we clearly are trying to figure out how to manage this totally unprecedented situation? That was also where we had, even the Ohio Democratic Party was advocating for this April 28th date. I'm not exactly sure why. Theory, to wrap up the presidential primary as well. Everyone was trying to like move that forward. But, it felt like we were alone in some ways, just like, what is this? And then the Secretary of State was still saying June 2nd up until the state legislature ruled. So a lot of confusion. And the biggest thing is here in Ohio right now, if you want an absentee ballot, you have to mail in a hard copy of a request form, an application to request an absentee ballot with your signature before they will send you a ballot. And that signature has to be the same signature.
You have to vote, basically. I mean, in terms of the execution of that.
Yeah, the steps involved, and it has to include some form of ID. It has to match the signature that you gave when you registered to vote. If it doesn't, and we talked to these people, got it sent back, then you have to reapply. So it's and then you have to provide the postage to send in that application, which is a poll tax. I mean, straight up. Yeah. And so when you say, how did this impact some already, some populations that might be already prone to disenfranchisement? Well, one, as I referenced before, young people who had been sent home and are now figuring out how to work online in their coursework while also learning they're not going to get any stimulus payment, right? They now have to figure out how to get this form and postage sent off. We talked to people, 18-year-olds, who didn't know that election mail would require postage, that they don't send letters, right? So this was also learning how to engage with
But we still have
postal
stamps?
system.
You're
Yeah,
like,
exactly,
girl.
exactly. And I was like,
Honey.
yeah, I get it. I don't really send a lot of letters anymore, right? Immigrant community, no accommodation for translation services. There were a lot of immigrants in 11% of our districts, foreign born, who showed up for early voting because then you're allowed to bring in a translator to help you vote. But there was they were not included in that group of people who they upfront said would be able to show up and vote, which, was only disabled.
And was
homeless
that a
people.
big population in terms of like who you hope would vote for you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we had strong connections and base within the Somali community here. We have the second largest Somali population in the country in the 3rd district. And I also had been working quite closely with the Nepali Bhutanese refugee community, which we have the largest population in Central Ohio, that community in the whole country. So that was frustrating. And ultimately, our whole pitch to a lot of people who we engage with, knock doors on, these are people who had given up on the political system, not necessarily regular voters. And everything about this process reinforced the idea that this system is stacked against us. Our message throughout the campaign was, no, come back. Like, we can build and organize to change this. And then we have this extended campaign period that is showing everything, every suspicion that people already have. And that, that's very frustrating. And the people—
It's disillusioning.
It's very
like you trick yourself into having a little bit of hope. You're like, I know it's stupid, but let me have a little hope.
Right.
And then
this, and there's people who were immediately hit by the pandemic, not just, oh, now I have to work from home and it's kind of boring, but I just lost my job and there is no game plan here. And those are our base, right? Working class people. And so, that was very, very frustrating. But, all that being said, I mean, we rallied and we really did everything we possibly could to try to connect with as many people as possible, let them know about this process, mailing them the application, hand delivering the application. And people were very appreciative of that effort we put in when, really the institutions that you would think, well, that we know have the resources to do these kinds of things, Democratic Party, the Secretary of State, the governor, the state legislature, if they wanted to greenlight funding for that, they weren't doing it. They were just like, oh, here's our decision on high, and people figure it out. And if, most of the people living here don't figure it out, well, whatever, and we just couldn't accept that. So we really stepped up and tried to do as much as we could to get people still to go through this process.
If you could wave a wand and say, like, now it's a Morgan election, like, what would that look like? Like, how would you, within our current constraints, which don't seem to be going anywhere very quickly, I mean, there's primaries coming up in other states like New York, and what would it look like to make it as easy as possible for those populations in particular? Like within the corona.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. I mean, one, we have to get rid of, and it seems like, New York, for example, has a better system of you at least can apply, and they've made some adjustments here. At least you can apply online and just request your vote. We actually have a worst case scenario here where there's a form online where you go to request your absentee ballot, but it's just a form that fills out a PDF that you still have to print. So we talked to a lot of people that filled out that PDF form and thought that would automatically go to the Board of Elections, but in fact, they didn't realize they had to print out an online form and then still mail it in, right? So it's so confusing. So just make it that either it's in an online request or you automatically send out ballots. The only thing I would say asterisk in the Corona era about, not necessarily wanting the automatic sending of ballots is that a lot of people are figuring out their situation here and going through a lot of transition. And so if you are changing your address, it would be a shame for the ballot to go to an address that you're no longer living at. So making sure that people can, in some way dictate what address they're going to, because we know a lot of people are in flux right now. But I will say that we have got to get people, and this is not the most vulnerable among us. This is the people that are comfortable, so comfortable that they don't feel obligated to research what they're voting for, that are willing to take a sample ballot or a mailer that the party sends out only featuring endorsed Democratic candidates and take that at face value and just vote down the line, voting blue no matter who. That mentality has killed us. And we have got to get out of this mindset that just because someone is a Democrat, that they are the person who is best serving us, or that they should not, that there's not another Democratic alternative that's out there. And so I really, think that a lot of people who are more, secure, who have the luxury of just, feeling great that they are voting Democratic, it's like, no, I mean, we have to be holding ourselves and our elected officials to a higher standard, and people need to earn these positions, not just because some party officials have designated that they get to appear on a piece of mail. But that's something that really needs to change. And, I was talking to a youth Baptist ministry group earlier this week, and they were asking, why is it so important to vote? And it's like, it's important to vote because we have political power when we organize and exercise it, but it's just as important to look into who you're voting for. And I don't think there's been enough of an emphasis on that second priority for us as a Black community and as a country and as a party. We have to open up this process and make sure that people understand we have different policy positions, we have choices, and we need to own those choices and exercise them appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, there's people over. I mean, I'm not sure who said this, but someone was implying that you were kind of anti-Black, or the support you were getting was like from Justice Democrats was anti-Black. You're like, I'm Black. So
I'm Black, and also the CBC takes a lot of money from corporations, right? My opponent takes money, profited off of the payday lending industry that has wreaked incredible havoc on Black community. And so, I cannot even begin to tell you my level of frustration with this idea that just because you're running against a Black member of Congress, and this really shows the hypocrisy of it all, even when you are a Black candidate, the reaction isn't, well, look, we have two Black people that have different perspectives on what might best serve the Black community, right? And the community at large. It's no, trying to somehow denigrate me, make people think that I'm not really Black, instead of, again, being honest with people about what's going on. And that's something that we truly cannot afford to accept any longer.
Yeah, I mean, honesty is not what's gotten them there, I mean, unfortunately. So kind of getting to more tactics, what were in your mind, the most effective ways to reach people during this kind of restricted environment?
Phone banking was effective. We did a lot of phone banking. We also did a lot of, chase calls for voters who had requested absentee ballots. The Board of Elections releases data about the people whose applications they have processed, and we were able to what's called chase them if there are valid numbers. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the numbers are not valid and it's disconnected. So we, as a progressive movement, as a Democratic Party, I think do need to do a better job of having good data about our voters. But then also, especially with races and campaigns where they have more time, thinking about using and prioritizing financial resources towards doing more mailers, which isn't a traditional tactic, I think, for progressive campaigns, because we're grassroots, we're door knocking. Door knocking is, much more effective at getting through to people. But in this era where we can't necessarily do that, then we got to think about having really engaging mailer material as well. And unfortunately, that was one thing that we tried to adjust for as much as we could, but when you budget down to spend March 17th, everything you have, and then have to build back up for an additional month, there's only so much that we were able to do by mail. But I really encourage other candidates, other races to think about how to best utilize a mailing strategy, because that's what the establishment is built for, is just putting a lot of money into those mailers, getting them out to people as quickly as possible, and then flooding the market with TV ads. We were able to put up a TV ad, but my opponent, who ultimately spent over $2 million on the race, was able to put up ads all day long.
And how much did you spend?
We spent a little under $800,000.
Oh, wow. So yeah, you're trying to make up all that name recognition with half the money, less than half the money.
Well, yeah, and that's how much she spent on the race.
I know that. Well, that's how scared she must have been too.
Yeah, and the state party spending money, and the county party as well. So.
And in terms of expertise, I mean, it's enough just to run for Congress and get your message out there and your story. With all of this, you need to become almost a public health agency. Mm-hmm. You need to become a media organization in terms of like disseminating the proper information to the community. Like,
yeah.
What expertises do you think need to be built into some of these campaigns that wouldn't normally be?
It's everything. You're right. I mean, the marketing, it is marketing. It's info. I don't know, infomercial is the right word, but being able to really like walk people through step by step what's going on. We hosted weekly community conversations on Facebook to try to become, a trusted information source of what people were hearing about the pandemic, but also trying to use it as an opportunity to educate people when they think about universal healthcare, which for some people I think might have been a little bit more theoretical for some points in the campaign. It's like, no, when you have a public health or a healthcare system that is not based in profit, it allows us to better prepare for situations like these that are public health crises, right? But public health crises will never be profitable. And so our for-profit hospital system will never serve us as well as we should be served for these types of situations. Those kinds of things. And yeah, and I think especially now where people are getting information from all over, it is incumbent on our elected officials to this ceremonial form of leadership that I know I feel like we grew up in, of you have your Congress people and you wave goodbye and they head to Washington and then occasionally show up when they're running again. Nobody's got time for that, right? Because we are in trouble here, right? And there's never, and at this point, and this was this was one thing in the campaign, just in terms of like even, local media covers, like we don't have a lot of trusted sources of information. There's so much bias. And so we really need our elected officials to be people first, to be for us and hands-on. And that goes down to serving the community, direct service. That's not necessarily something you always see congressional candidates or elected officials doing, but we got to be there, not just the photo op, not just for a campaign, but like on the ground serving people. So that's how they know you can be trusted, right?
Right, exactly. You could almost say that this actually allows people to prove what they care about what they're saying. Because now we're in a crisis. Like what you do during a crisis, if you stay behind your bubble or you're kind of removed from the population that you're supposed to represent, that says a lot. I mean, I think that is that the best way to reach voters who, maybe before they were caring about gentrification, now they're caring about themselves being homeless with no money and there's a global health pandemic. How do you what's the hierarchy of importance? Is voting even as important as, oh my God, my grandma's got pre-existing conditions for a pandemic?
I mean, that comes down to the individual. I definitely, I'm thinking as you were talking about one guy who he had requested an application from us to request the absentee ballot. But by the time we had delivered the application and then we were calling to follow up with him to make sure he submitted it and got his ballot, is like, my mom got COVID. Like, I'm done with the voting portion of what I'm thinking about, right? And it's like totally understood. It's sad, but that's where you're at. So yeah, I mean, you have to be cognizant that people are going through a lot right now, and it is hard to get people focused on voting when I think there is such a high level of disillusionment with our overall political process. But that's why I think we got to keep pushing, candidates in there. We do what we can, but also those of us who now are either on the other side of campaigns or, in a different lane entirely, we have to really be thinking about what's the infrastructure we're building to improve on some of these processes, make it easier to vote, and also, prepare for progressive campaigns of the future, because we are it, right? And so even when we're not successful in individual elections, I do think that our generation is uniquely prepared to be the type of leaders that we're describing, that are fluent in all these different forms of communication, that understand intrinsically what people are suspicious of in this traditional political system, and to offer something different and fight for the policies that people are looking for. And so we've got to keep building so that we have more and more people that win and we gain political power.
I want to get your feedback, or I want to get your ideas about the big upcoming election, but just to give people a grounding for how it affected your campaign. So what was the turnout after all of this? Give us 2016, maybe the most, most recent comparable example, and then like what did happen?
Yeah, so 2016 was our closest comp, because that was the last presidential primary. For Franklin County, or for 3rd District in particular, there were over 120,000 people that voted in that 2016 primary, Democratic primary. And this year, with the change to the all mail-in absentee and Corona pandemic, we surpassed only 60,000 people,
Wow.
a little over 60,000 people who voted in total. So about half as many people voted.
Do we have a
And
sense of who those people were?
we're still working on the demographic breakdown, but I will just say anecdotally, and who we were able to catch on the phone, it's who you would expect, who is least impacted by what's going on right now. Well, if you're art, and these are people I had individual conversations with that were very upfront about it. It's like, oh, how are you doing right now? Because that was how we were starting our calls. Like, are you okay? Do you need to be connected to community resources? And they're like, I'm retired. I'm on a pension. Yes, this is different because everyone else is at home too, but this isn't that different from my day to day, right? And so, most
And
of
my
the
money's
people,
fine.
and the money's okay because you got a pension. It's like, what? No one who's under 40 is about to get a pension,
Yeah, ever.
or ever, right? Yeah, but I would say it felt like 90% of the people I talked to were 55 and above on calls that we actually were able to get a hold of. And so I'm guessing, though I don't have the confirmation on it, this election skewed very much in the direction of older voters. Though I will say, in defense of the boomer generation, that we got a fair number of people that were receptive to our message, that understood, hey, we have a situation here that our generation created. We don't know what to do about it. You all have some ideas. You all need to go for it, but yeah, that's not everyone. And it's a lot. And also people who are more affluent, who are this is an inconvenience because now I have to stay at home and work remotely, not, oh my God, my whole life is crashing down around me. And I might not go through an absentee ballot process. So my guess would be that it's skewed more affluent, older, in terms of the 60,000 or so that ended up voting in this election.
Which might, not give a lot of liberal reform candidates, happy feeling, in terms of what they should anticipate. So I hope that some of them are watching this saying, like, how do we account for that? What would you, specifically to the people who are still going to be in primaries, not the general election, which we'll get to in a second, but for other people who are in your exact position and maybe they have a better, more adaptable system than Ohio has, like, what would you tell them?
Really have to focus on the mailer, like I was saying. The mailers are just going to be so critical. And then also, one other positive side effect of this is some media buys that might have been really expensive before, when you're competing with a lot of companies that want to advertise, or especially earlier on with the presidential races, it could be more affordable to do TV. So people are at home trying to do as many TV ads as possible. And, in some ways it breaks my heart a little bit to say things like that, because that's not, reflective of like a true grassroots campaign. It's like, we got to be real about where people are at and how we can catch them. So, so people who have a little more lead time with that, trying to make sure that they're getting out there in the ways that we do think, will be effective when everyone's staying at home. But also keeping up with the real ethos of what it is to present a different style of leadership. And that is getting out in the community, still, complying with all the social distancing, but showing up, and we're still doing that. Produce giveaways and meal delivery and all that. We have to continue to show what it looks like to not be about just electoral politics, to truly be down for the community conversations, be that trusted source of information, hosting virtual rallies. That was one thing that, I was a little skeptical of when we started, but we had one virtual rally that really did capture that same feeling that I would get at the community in-person rallies that we were doing every weekend leading up to the campaign. And we had, co-hosts and all that. So I do think it's possible to capture that energy and create it online. But, we just have to be disciplined. We still have to be strategic and reach out to people. And people are looking for connection now, even as, we all adjust, especially I would say as we adjust to this reality situation.
Yeah, this like surreality.
Yeah, exactly. But it's possible. But it's possible, and we just have to keep going.
If you had told me in January that there was something that would happen that would make me, for a time, forget about the presidential election, I would have been like, you're out of your mind.
Yeah,
there's literally no way. But like 2 or 3 weeks into this, I remember being like, I haven't thought about Joe Biden in like 10 days, and I was like, that's insane. But I think that, after this
might be a problem.
that specifically is a big problem. But I'm just saying, in general, all I could think about was the import of this election, and I think that's kind of where we're going to shift to as this waxes and wanes or wanes and then jumps right back. I mean, it's very possible that we could be where you were in mid-March in October, depending on kind of the impact of these loosening restrictions. So is there a scenario in which you think it's wise to push November back? What do you think should happen in November?
Yeah, I mean, I think now we have the lead time to, one, create better mail-in voting procedures and be more proactive about getting people ballots, like some states that have been light years ahead on this, like Oregon, and just make that possible for people. You know what I would like to say, one thing very specifically, because now I see that we're talking about, and this is the other great thing about being post-campaign, but a lot of the ideas we talked about the campaign, that people look at you like you're crazy, right? It's like, oh, universal income, we can't just give people money. It's like, oh, well, actually,
like, oh,
we just did that just happened. Right? Yeah, like universal healthcare,
and you wanted
that's
that.
crazy, right? Exactly. And so jobs guarantee, what's the point of a jobs guarantee? It's that we have needs as a country that we need to be able to respond to, that it might not be profitable for the market to respond to, but our needs nonetheless, and an opportunity to create more stable living wage jobs for people. I hear now they're talking about having like a contact tracing workforce that helps to, usher in this whatever, reopening, though I think it's being rushed entirely, but down the line, how we get towards any type of reopening depends on having extreme and well instituted, contact tracing everywhere. And so thinking about a workforce for that, I'd like to see an enfranchisement workforce, right? I mean, we do it for the census. We are willing to do it for public health. Why are we not also willing to come and meet people where they're at to make sure that they are able to vote, And so you can get the ballot and the information. I think now we understand with the social distancing how to do that effectively. And that would be a way for the federal government to make sure as many people vote as possible. And then, I think we need to be real about some of the things that hurt us in our campaigns, like translation services. Even if that's not a disability, that is something that will disproportionately impact people for whom English is a second language, and especially in states where maybe they're not as up to speed on providing materials in multiple languages. We need to make sure that we're pushing for that. And then, preserving an in-person option if that's what it comes to. I think here there was a lot of confusion. It wasn't until a couple of days before on the local news, the election officials started saying like, oh, and by the way, if you haven't received your absentee ballot, you can vote with a provisional ballot in person. But by that point, we had almost a month of this extended election period.
That wasn't possible.
Yeah, we were saying like there's no in-person option unless you're disabled or you don't have a home address. So this kind of like, it has to be consistent information early, but I think there isn't a need to potentially preserve an in-person option for people for whom the mailing process is maybe not feasible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most important thing, and that's what's so hard about this, is that things being consistent, like kind of sticking with something, like deciding like no matter what, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's what Corona has made very difficult, because people feel like, well, we can't just do that because we need to be responsive. But I'm very concerned about how this could be used to be a gigantic tool for disenfranchisement. What do you think like the longer term impact of this period will be? And what do you hope it will result in?
I hope it will result in, and in many ways, I think our campaign was an expression of this, and the impact we're already seeing is more and more people seeing that we know as much as we need to know to lead in some ways, right? Like when we get organized, we can demand more of us should be running for office. It's not a question of, oh, is it the right time? Has the right person told me it's my turn? No, it's if you feel like you have a voice to represent for your community, get out there, let's get organized, and let's put ourselves out there. Because I have to say, I mean, I understand the feelings of disillusionment, because I don't have a lot of faith in many of our elected officials to, in a fundamental level, be honest. Just be honest about what's going on, and to communicate clearly, to your point, about what we should be doing, or presenting an affirmative vision beyond just bashing each other on each side, an affirmative vision of what a better future would look like, and being willing to put the energy and the legwork and the time into organizing people to support it. So I believe that we can build for a better future, but it is still just like the original premise of why I felt like I had to run this campaign, run for Congress, is it's only going to change though with more and more of us waking up who are willing to be honest and put ourselves out there and not wait, demand change.
And you know who never worries about, like, do I have enough experience? Like, should I have proven myself? Is like mediocre people who are in there now. I don't think any of these people up in there now were like, well, you know what? Like, I should probably like go back to school and like make sure. No, it's like
Yeah.
the people who I think are on the ground who are smart. Like, if you're the kind of person that actually wants to be qualified and make sure that you're able to like give authentic leadership to your community, then you're probably already light years ahead of who we got.
Exactly.
So I encourage you to, if you feel that way, to go about it. And I guess kind of lastly, now that the campaign is over, it's like you didn't just disappear. Like now you're in this community with roots, with organizing. You have much more name recognition. So what is your presence going to be in the community now?
Yeah, still figuring that out. I mean, immediately after the campaign, it looked very similar to what it was before. It's like still getting out in the community, showing up at service events, trying to do whatever we can to get through this period. But, I'm still figuring out the details of like an official thing. I'm really focused on building out the platform and the infrastructure that we've created. We have had an amazing network of people. And when I say of all ages, races, socioeconomic backgrounds who gave our campaign life and aren't going anywhere, right? And so we need to continue to build, engage more people. And I'm interested in creating the infrastructure that allows us to continue to grow and also support other people who are running as well. I think that's really needed here, especially in Ohio, because, one of the weaknesses, I would say, and this is across the country really, is, a lot of organizing, grassroots organizing dating back to Obama campaigns, that it was all driven from a presidential campaign candidate. And then when that candidate goes or when that campaign is over, it kind of just dies, right? And so we have to have more of the grassroots organizing that is connected to down ballot races, candidates, and also an infrastructure that's somewhat independent of the campaign so that we continue to build and it's not reinventing the wheel every single election. So that's what I'm interested in.
Well, good. Well, I think that you are extremely well set up to do it. I'm so proud of you. I think it is actually very inspiring. As someone who I think started out, like I got to college and I was like, I'm gonna be the first Black president. And then like, obviously that didn't work. I didn't make it to that point, but I think that like I became more and more disillusioned by the people who wanted to be in leadership, in government. It's like, if you're like, I want to be a senator, I'm like, I'm gonna keep my eye on you because you're probably the last person we need. And so I think that it's nice and refreshing to meet people who have options and could do a lot of things with their life that could actually have a huge and positive impact on the world. And yet you're choosing to do this.
That's true. Yeah, but a lot of the leaders that people are holding up right now in the pandemic era, it's like the head of New Zealand, Germany. It's like, these are leaders that I think do represent that. And we can have that too, right? The people that are just competent, it's not asking for a lot. Just like
bare competence is like, that should be the minimum.
Right.
You don't have to inspire me, just make sure I don't die.
Right. But if you can inspire too, that's helpful. But just be honest.
Obviously, if you can do it with panache, I'll take that. I'll definitely take
exactly.
that.
And we're gonna get there.
Well, I guess like, given that you lost, and obviously there's a lot of factors for that, like kind of what keeps you optimistic? Like besides the fact that we desperately need this change, what makes you at all confident that it's coming? If you are.
I am.
I would assume you are.
I am, yes.
Better
because there was a time, I'll say, when I was in Washington, D.C. after college, that I couldn't imagine someone like me running for Congress, to be honest, in Ohio, that I didn't feel like I would have any feasibility, any opportunity or viability, I should say, any opportunity to be my authentic self and believe what I believe and say what I believe and get any traction, because everything I was hearing, and really the tradition that I was trained in Washington, is more of like a neoliberal, what we now call, a neoliberal style of politics. And that never felt exactly right for me. I always felt I was a little bit more, what we would now progressive. and but didn't know if that would match with also not being some of the personality types that you described. Like, could I just be my authentic self who isn't a psychopath and actually cares about people and ultimately is coming from a place of service and get any traction? And we did. And so, you know, and I was inspired by a lot of women who had done this in 2018 to feel like I can do it too. And I hope that that just continues to have a ripple effect throughout our state, here in Central Ohio, across the country, and it's happening. And so many people are running progressive campaigns. You know, ours got a lot of pickup in the media and all that, but I've connected with so many people running across the country who are doing it, and we're just going to grow. And ultimately, you know, I was talking to someone yesterday when I was walking down the street who was congratulating me on the campaign, and, you know, older white guy, and he was like, "You all are the future. And even though I'm not young, I want to be part of that future, and I want you guys to win." And so, you know, really committed to just trying to help us continue to build here in Central Ohio. And I think we're seeing that as a country, and I am optimistic for that reason.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, Morgan, I really appreciate you joining me, my first guest.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
This is great.
Tell people how can we reach you?
morganharper.org, so our website, so they can sign up to get more info about anything that's going on, and yeah, or email me, morgan@morganharper.org.
All right, awesome. All right, thank you so much, Morgan. This is a delight. Keep believing. You know,
oh yeah,
help me.
I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you so much.
Tell everybody you know, I'm not going anywhere.
I literally am.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Good luck with the podcast. Thanks.
For
Bye.
sure.
That was great. Thank you so much, Morgan, for coming. You were fantastic. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, which will include unseating Miss Beatty next time, you know, if that's what you like to do. So I want to just discuss a little bit of what we go and do, like the takeaways of this conversation. So one thing I think we need to remember is that we got to ignore the status quo in terms of like what it takes to be a politician or qualified to become a candidate. First of all, most of these people do not know what they are doing. And so I think that, you know, Barack Obama just had his commencement address, God bless him. And he said that one thing that has become very clear is the leaders, you know, a lot of times don't know what they're doing, not even pretending to be in charge. So the typical pathway to become one of these people, I think is decreasing in credibility every fucking second. So I think, like, don't worry about that. Don't let that distract you or intimidate you. I mean, the less you have in common with some of these incumbents, I think the better, honestly. So I think that if you have values and you think you have the thing that actually candidates should have, and the people in mind that you represent, then I think that that's enough. Plenty of people who are checking all the boxes ain't doing shit for us. So anyway, that's what I'll say about that. I also think that in terms of how we need to be prepared as candidates, how are you going to reimagine and leverage things like mailings, things like lit drops, all these things that are non-in-person? I mean, obviously campaigns have been skewing digital for quite some time now, but when you can't even hold events and you don't need to kind of fan out an entire organization of volunteers to go canvass people's doors, I think you have to figure out how to better leverage what access you do have to reach the public. And I think that utilizing digital tools and trying to figure out what you can do with contactless avenues is really important. Lastly, and this is a pretty unique idea that I think is going to start gaining traction, is we need an agency of people that is nonpartisan, that is able to step people through this complicated and dynamic and ever-changing process to vote. It should not be on candidates on top of running a campaign and trying to make sure that like they have the money and the staff and the energy to kind of run what that takes. They also now have to explain how to vote to all of the voters in order for them to even get the votes. That should not be on them. I mean, first of all, lots of us don't even, a lot of people don't even have jobs. So the more jobs we can do that kind of make our situation have more efficacy and give people something that's really positive and encourages civic engagement, we got to do that. And so I think that a government agency that can spring up around elections, just like the census, and can guide people through what might be a different every time voting scenario, I think is a fantastic idea and one that I would love to see pursued. So that's this episode of What We Gonna Do. Morgan, again, thank you so much for joining us. You're fantastic. And I cannot wait for you to eventually unseat Joyce, if that is what you choose to do. You got, if not a voter, because I'm unlikely to move to Ohio, but you definitely have a supporter. And so thank you everyone for tuning in, and check out our next episode tomorrow with Robbie Apple.